Operation Barbarossa. Operation Barbarossa was the code name for the invasion of the Soviet Union by Nazi Germany and some of its Axis allies during World War II. It started on June 22, 1941. It was the largest military invasion in human history, with more than 3 million men attacking along an 1,800-mile front. The code name was a tribute to Frederick I, a German king and Holy Roman Emperor who had led a crusade to the east in the 12th century.
I'll get started here. First of all, just a little bit of background on me for those who don't know me very well. I was a historian for the U.S. Air Force for almost 30 years, and I retired well before I should have at the age of 60 back in 2011, because I just couldn't write these utterly dry, numbingly boring institutional histories any longer after 27 years. So I quit well before I should have. But the good thing about doing that is I was able to write a few books that otherwise I would have never done. And this is my big magnum opus, if you can see it. I don't know if you can see it on the screen. Barbarossa Unleashed, which came out almost exactly, hard to believe, but almost exactly 10 years ago now. It's almost 500,000 words, great color maps in the book, and over 225 photos, including quite a few out of that National Archives record group that Steve was talking about, record group 242, and a lot of photos that were provided to me by the 70 or 80 German veterans of Operation Barbarossa that I was able to interview or correspond with. And then a few years later, I published this book, First Day on the Eastern Front, which is kind of a out of the box kind of thing. It's totally unique. I don't know that anybody else, at least in the English speaking, in the Anglosphere, has ever done this. It's just a study of the first 21 hours of Hitler's attack on Russia, because they attacked, as you know, just after 3 a.m, in granular detail, going all across the front, using largely German, but also a fair amount of Russian sources. I used my German's pretty good. My Russian, except for spasiba, which means thank you, is pretty much non-existent. But David Glantz turned me on to Richard Harrison, who is a tremendous historian and translator of Russian to English. And so he translated a fairly large tranche of Russian documents for me. And I was able to incorporate that into the book. And then there's the book I did in 2020 with David Stahel, Soldiers of Barbarossa. And this has 509, I actually counted them one day because I got curious, 591 letters and diary entries of German soldiers written during the first 6 months from June. We started on the 15th of June and went through the 15th of December. And there's no whitewashing. It lays out the good, the bad, and the ugly. You know, one minute they're talking about some combat action, and the next somebody's banging Jews over the head with a club. But that's a fairly unique book, which we did, and it was, I must say, it was a wonderful experience working with David. It went as smooth as a baby's bottom. We just worked together terrifically. And then my other Barbarossa related book is this memoir by Heinrich Hoppe. Moscow tram stop. And he had been a doctor with actually the 18th Infantry Regiment, which was a very elite infantry regiment. It was one of the 10 or 12 infantry regiments the Germans were allowed to have as a result of the Versailles Treaty. It became part of the 6th Infantry Division, which was attached to 9th Army at the start of Barbarossa on the far left flank of Field Marshal von Bock's Army Group Center. And Dr. Hoppe made the march all the way to pretty close to Moscow, up to the town of Reshev, and fought on the Eastern Front until through May of 1943, in the course of which, during those 2 years, he became one of the most highly decorated doctors on the Eastern Front, with the Iron Cross first and second class. He won a special medal for single-handedly destroying a T-34. And he also was a recipient of the quite prestigious German Cross in Gold. He had been put in for the Ritterkreuz, the Knight's Cross, but the Fuhrer turned it down. So he got the German Cross in Gold instead. But that's just a little bit of my bona fides there. Now to get to the topic, I think what Dr. Kramer was going to talk about was how the Red Army was able to survive the initial hammer blows by the German Wehrmacht and actually prevail and stop the German blitzkrieg literally just kilometers outside of Moscow. And just as an aside, one of the German soldiers I interviewed, I think he was in the 2nd Panzer Division, in an I think 150 millimeter schwere artillery Abteilung, a medium artillery battery, and his unit literally made it to the suburbs of Moscow and actually fired a few shells into the city. Well, fast forward a number of decades after Glasnost and the fall of the Soviet Union, he's on a bus taking a tour through Moscow, and and the woman taking the tour saying, "Well, now we're coming to a point here where during the dark days of World War II, the fascists actually lobbed a few shells into Russia," and he's sitting back there and he's thinking, "That was me. I did that," but he figured at that point that discretion was the better part of valor, so he kept that to himself. The German army on the 22nd of June, 1941, may have been the most spectacular fighting force in terms of its training, the quality of its lower ranking and non-commissioned officers, its experience, that Europe had just about ever seen. I mean, you could argue maybe Napoleon was, but certainly it was the largest invasion army that Europe had ever seen. We're talking about 153 divisions, if you account the few that were up with the Army Oberkommando Norwegen up in Norway, 4 or 5 divisions there, about 3.2 million men, 3,250 tanks, 250 assault guns. What was the number? I think precisely 7,614 artillery pieces of like 75 millimeter or above, and 2,250 combat aircraft that were fully operational on the 22nd of June. The Luftwaffe force structure in the East included about 2,700 planes, but of those, a little more than 2,200 were actually combat capable or mission capable, as we would say in the Air Force, on the 22nd of June. Of these 148 divisions that were in the main defensive line from the Baltic to the Black Sea, 120 of them were in the first German echelon that attacked on at either 3:05 or 3:15 in the morning on the 22nd of June on the left flank, that is in Ritter von Lieb's Army Group North and the left wing of Army Group Center. They actually attacked at 3:05, because you figure how long the front is. The sun's in that latitude. The sun's coming up a little earlier, and they wanted to attack precisely at dawn. So they attacked at 3:05. The right flank, I should say, much to the chagrin of Field Marshal von Bock, who wanted the entire offensive to begin at 1500 hours. But it did begin at that time with the right flank of Army Group Center and all of Field Marshal Geert von Rundstedt's Army Group South. As I think you all know the basics of the story. I will say one thing that I think is a point that a lot of people miss. Operation Barbarossa was actually the first campaign that Hitler and the German High Command had actually planned tactically and certainly strategically to be a true blitzkrieg. Not Poland, not the Low Countries, certainly not Norway, and surprisingly not France. Even though they took France out literally in 42 days, something that they weren't able to do in more than 4 years between 1914 and 1918. That did turn into a blitzkrieg campaign, but largely because of fortuitous events and because of the fact that after Guderian's I think he had the 19th Motorized Corps at that time in Field Marshal von List's Army Group. They managed to break through because of a number of fortuitous events at Sedan, and then he just raced for the English Channel without paying any attention to his orders and forcing all the Hitler and his high command to I don't know, take some sort of Valium or whatever. They were so freaked out by the fact that he was moving so quickly, and they wanted him to slow down. But that's another story for another day. So Barbarossa was indeed planned as a blitzkrieg, and in fact, I don't know that I'm the most original thinker in the world, but something that I did come out of my own little brain was the way I look at Hitler's attack on Russia is that it was the 1941 equivalent of a nuclear first strike. Everything, it was planned as a massive hammer blow that was going to destroy the Red Army through these deep armored envelopments, destroy the mass of the Red Army west of the major river barriers, the Dnieper River and the Western Dvina, which reach about 500 kilometers inside of the Russo-German frontier. And the campaign was supposed to end in 8 to 10 weeks. It wasn't supposed to go on for 418 or 417 more, 1,417 more days, and end up with the Russian battle flag being raised above the Reichstag. That was not the goal when they started out. In fact, Paulus, I always want to say Fun Paulus, but no, he was not Fun Paulus. He came from a middle-class family, and he had been hired by Franz Halder, the chief of the general staff, to serve as his Oberquartiermeister, kind of his principal aide. And he had actually worked out after Marx and Lossberg and a couple others had worked out basic plans for Barbarossa in the in late 40, early 41. Halder had actually turned over to there I go, turned over to Paulus. Said, here, you run with it, and you work off of the plan that Marx had put together, and put together a more detailed battle plan for us. And funny thing is, he would bring his work home, and his wife, he couldn't, as much as he might have tried, he couldn't hide from his wife what he was doing. He had two sons who were both lieutenants in the Wehrmacht. And frankly, I don't know what happened to them. But his wife found out, oh my God, you were actually working on an invasion of Russia. And she was gobsmacked. And they literally argued about it. You said, you got to be out of your effing mind, dude. We're planning an invasion of Russia. And her husband would simply say, I am a soldier. I do what I'm told. If this is what the national leadership has planned, that's not my problem. So that's kind of a interesting little sidebar. But just hours after the invasion had begun, getting back to the idea of the Blitzkrieg, Paulus had walked into the General Staff headquarters, and the commander-in-chief of the army, Field Marshal von Brauchitsch, was there. And he asked Paulus, what's your thinking? What's your thinking on how long this campaign is going to last? And he said, Field Marshal, I think probably we're talking about 8 to 10 weeks. And Brauchitz's response was, that's exactly right. That's exactly what we think it's going to take. So of course that's not what happened. In the opening weeks of the campaign, everything seemed to go, as you all know, spectacularly. I don't need to go into all the encirclement battles, particularly on the Central Front. The first one with the two panzer groups that were attached to Army Group Center, Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group and Hermann Hoth's 3rd Panzer Group. Hoth came down from the north, Guderian up from the south, and around the 26th of June, they met at in the area around Minsk, and encircled I think the 3rd, 4th, and 10th armies of Pavlov's Western Front, and managed to, that went on for a couple of weeks. I think through the 9th of July. The frontier battles are the period that formally went on from the 22nd of June through the 9th of July, 1941. That's how David Glons looks at it. And I think that's pretty much a conventional way of seeing it. But that's when the first encirclement ended, right around Minsk. And I will say, from the very, very literally the opening hours of the campaign, and I have read thousands of field post letters of German soldiers, many, many memoirs, had discussions with German veterans or correspondents. From literally the opening hours, they realized that they were going up against an enemy that was nothing like what they had faced in previous campaigns. Yes, indeed, there were some Russian units that surrendered en masse at the start of the campaign, but I think these were mostly units from Eastern Poland, Western Ukraine, areas, and the Baltic states, areas that had been taken over by Russia. First of all, when they had invaded Eastern Poland on the 17th of September, 1939, and then they invaded the Balkan states in June of 1940. And around the same time, they also took over Bessarabia and northern Bukovina in the south from Romania. And of course, they pressed tens of thousands, at least, of young men from these regions into the Red Army, and many of them didn't have any desire to fight for the Red Army. So there were units that did surrender in mass, but that was kind of the exception to the rule, because in most cases, even from the opening hours of the campaign, after the after the Red Army had recovered from the initial shock, they fought with just an absolute ferocity, even as the Germans might say and did say, with a fanaticism, absolute fanaticism. And it was actually quite shocking to, and I could provide so many different accounts, quite shocking to the German soldiers. And the very good Israeli historian Omer Bartov, who wrote a book. I have it sitting in my one of my book files here. I won't try and go get it, but he says, he posits that the criminal activities committed by the Red Army against German POWs primarily, or against Red Cross personnel, doctors, that they were very much in response to the German behavior when from the very start of the invasion. In other words, the Germans were killing POWs. They were, doing all sorts of bad things, and the Russian atrocities were simply in response to that. Well, I'm not in any way trying to whitewash the German atrocities, because we know what happened. The Einsatzgruppen, the death squads, which followed into Russia on the wake of the German army, actually came in and started their mass murder activities literally the day after Barbarossa Tag on the 23rd of June. So I'm not in any way trying to downplay that, but it is quite clear that Soviet propaganda from 1917 on had done a tremendous job of indoctrinating an entire new generation of young Russians, and particularly to hate not just the greedy Western capitalists, but particularly the Germans. And from the very first hours of the campaign, there are many reports, for example, of a German reconnaissance squad that kind of got out ahead of their skis and a little too far into the front. They got captured. They were immediately murdered in the most vicious ways imaginable. They were mutilated, and in many cases had all their extremities cut off. And I don't need to go into details. You're all men, and I think you can imagine what I'm talking about there. But this kind of thing was fairly common right from the very, very start of the campaign, and it had nothing to do with being a reaction to the German criminal activity, which was horrific enough. But anyway, let's move on. After the frontier battles ended around the the 9th of July, and I should say, to back up, in the north, Field Marshal Ritter von Lieb, he only had like 29 divisions, and only a few armored divisions, 2 armored corps, a few armored divisions, a couple mechanized divisions, but they were able to advance very quickly up through the Baltic states and toward Leningrad. The Germans on the Central Front were across the Western Dvina and the Dnieper by the sometime in the second week of July. And in the South, I must point out, von Rundstedt's Army Group South, he had something like, if I recall, 41 divisions, only 1 Panzer Corps under Field Marshal von Kleist, which had 5 panzer divisions, roughly, I believe, and 4 mechanized, and a total of about 715 tanks. But his tanks were all of German manufacture. They were, some of the outmoded Panzer Is and Panzer IIs, most of which they had gotten rid of, except as maybe as reconnaissance vehicles or command tanks. But most of which, it's one of the things the Germans did do in the intervening period between their victory over France in June 40 and the start of Barbarossa in 41. While they didn't in any way dramatically increase the number of tanks that they had, and ironically enough, their tank production just rolled along at a leisurely pace of 200, 250 tanks a month. They did manage to redo their force structure somewhat by replacing hundreds of the Panzer Is and IIs with the Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks. In fact, they had, all told, among the 3,250 tanks or so, something over 900 Panzer IIIs, most of them outfitted with a 50 millimeter gun, but some still with just a 37 millimeter pea shooter. And I remember specifically, because of the numbers, easy to remember, they had 444 Panzer IVs with a, I think, an 75 millimeter L42 gun or something, a snub-nosed 75 millimeter gun. And ironically enough, as no doubt Steve knows, the Panzer IV was meant to be an infantry support tank, and the Panzer III, which they had, more than twice as many of at the start of the campaign, was intended, excuse me, my allergies acting up. Panzer III was intended to be the main battle tank, for tank-on-tank combat. But the Panzer IV proved so effective that it also became very effective in tank-on-tank combat, except initially against the KV-1s and the T-34s, which I'll try to get back to. If I don't, just remind me. The Russians actually began the campaign with 1,861, if I remember what I got out of Zhukov's memoirs, 1,861 KV-1s and T-34s in the Western frontier zones. But getting back to the South and von Rundstedt, he met the largest concentration of Russian forces in the Soviet Southwestern Front, commanded by Kirponos. And it had, for example, on Barbarossa tag, the Russians had, what was it? Something like 3,500,000 men in the Western frontier zone, 171 divisions, including 20 mechanized corps. 8 of those mechanized corps were with the what was then called the Kiev Military District, which, when the war started, became the Southwestern Front. So Kleist's 715 tanks and 5 panzer divisions entered into what I think to this day may still be the largest, little known. Everyone always thinks of Kursk, right? But this may have been, in that opening week of Barbarossa in the Ukraine, the largest tank battle in the history of the world, because you had literally thousands of tanks involved, and it took Kleist, with the help of infantry forces and the Luftwaffe, I don't know, a good week or 10 days or so to smash through those mechanized corps in the South. But Stalin had clearly expected, if the Germans did attack, it's clearly expected that their main attack was going to come in the South toward the Ukraine, then maybe on toward the Donbass and the oil of the Caucasus. So he had his largest forces in the Ukraine in the Kiev Military District, which also, under Soviet doctrine, which of course was very much an offensive doctrine, if the Germans did attack, as far as the Soviet doctrine was concerned, there was not going to be any fighting taking place on Russian soil, the Russians were going to immediately launch a counterattack, and their main counterattack was not going to come out of the center toward East Prussia, where the Germans had lots of defensive lines and there was a lot of difficult terrain, lakes and forests and so forth. No, sir, they were going to attack out of the south, out of the Ukraine, and cut through and cut up to the Baltic Sea, I guess, and cut the German forces off from the Baltic states. But that's no time to really get into that. But eventually, Kleist broke through, pushed on towards Zhytomyr and the Dnieper River. And very quickly, the Germans in the south got fairly close to Kiev. But then, in spite of that, it took them like an additional 2 months to actually capture the city in the middle of September. But I'm getting a little bit out ahead of my skis there. So in any case, through mid-July, everything was going extremely well. In fact, it was going so well that on the 14th or 15th of July, Hitler decided to move the Schwerpunkt, or the focus of German military production, from the army to the Luftwaffe and the Kriegsmarine, to the Navy, of course, in order to build up the air forces and the Navy for the final showdown for Weltmacht with the Anglo-American naval and air forces. That's what I guess Andre, the great German historian, would have called Adolf Hitler's Stufenplan. You know, just these various steps that he was taking. The first one, you know, defeat France and Western Europe, then capture the Russia with its grain and its ore, its minerals and its oil. And in doing so, Hitler would have established an autarkic, or economically self-sufficient, base on the European continent, from which to then challenge the Anglo-Amerikaner for world supremacy. So the man had quite a wild imagination, we might say, looking back. But here's the thing: through mid-July, in other words, the first 3 weeks or so, the Germans advanced at an average pace, certainly on the Central Front, of about 20 kilometers a day. After mid-July, it slowed down dramatically as the front lines became wider. You have to remember, if you look at a map, you can see my hand. Russia is kind of like, what's the word? I can think of the German word, a trichter. The terrain opens up like that. The deeper you go into Russia, the wider a funnel. Thank you for that. The at 73, my recall is not what it used to be. Yes, it's like a funnel. So the front just gets wider and broader and broader, and so the rate of advance slowed down to about 4 or 5 kilometers a day. And part of this was just the effectiveness of the obviously of the Red Army. I mean, too many people still think that, well, Hitler and the the Wehrmacht, it just plowed through Russia like a knife through butter, and then it started raining and the mud came and they all got stuck in the mud, and that's what stopped them. No, it was the tenacity of the Red Army, and the fact that while the Bolsheviki may not have been very effective at doing most things, they were very, very good when it came to force regeneration, either of their ground forces, their air forces, and they were constantly able, mobilizing more men, putting new units and new armies into the field. And I don't remember what the exact number was, but they created, literally from June to December, through December 1941, they created literally hundreds of new divisions and tank brigades after about October 1941, they didn't create any more tank divisions temporarily. They just created brigades. And during that period, they put something like, if you can imagine this, 50 new armies into the field. Now, they may have not been, as Halder pointed out in his diary in August, when he said early August, and keep in mind, on the 3rd of July, 1941, Halder had written in his diary that it is not too much to say that we have defeated the Red Army in 2 weeks. A month later, he was saying, "My God, we wipe out 12 Russian divisions, and then they just throw another 12 new ones at us, and they may not be as well trained or as well equipped, but they're there, and they keep attriting our forces." And so, literally by the beginning of August, not only Hitler but the high command, his high command, were really getting quite nervous about how the Barbarossa campaign was actually proceeding. And looking again at this issue of force regeneration, you're all aware that, of course, that the Luftwaffe had an app, which I'm going to talk about, I think on the 9th of March. The Luftwaffe had an absolutely fantastic day on the 22nd of June and the 23rd of June, 1941. I don't remember what the exact numbers were, but they wiped out something like 2,500 Russian aircraft, most of them on the ground. In fact, Reichsmarschall Hermann Goering, he didn't believe the numbers that they had actually been that successful. So he sent out a commission to investigate. And it turns out the commission came back and reported, I don't know, may have just have been in one of his staff, I don't remember if it was a commission or not, but came back and reported that, Herr Reichsmarschall, the numbers are actually of Russian destroyed Russian planes were actually higher than we thought they were. So they had that incredible success. And then you have Field Marshal von Kluge, who commanded the 4th Army in Army Group Center, actually complaining in early July, just a couple of weeks after the campaign had started, that we're still being harassed by the Russian Air Force. What's going on here? And so, just like the ground forces were able to continually regenerate themselves, the air forces did that too. And during just the period of the 17 or so days of the frontier battles through July 9th, the Russian bomber forces, and they really didn't have a strategic bomber force. It was more for support of ground forces and that sort of thing. But they conducted over, I believe the number was over 20,000 sorties. So it's kind of a myth to think, as I remember one very good source I read, I don't remember who it was, but some years back, saying that, in those first few days, they knocked out so many Russian planes that it really didn't, that the Red Air Force, the VVS, didn't really have an impact again until the fall of 1941. And that's simply not true. Now, they may have lacked experience, but they were there, and they actually conducted a few very, very successful attacks. I remember one time in one case in July 41, where they conducted a massive attack on a number of German airfields and surprised the Germans and took out dozens of German airplanes on the ground. So here you have the situation where through the middle of July, they're advancing at a rapid pace, 20 kilometers a day. They're thinking that Hitler's shifting production away from the army, which would work out really bad when it came to the fall and winter, because the artillery was one of the reasons they didn't have enough shells. Kind of like the situation for other reasons, I guess, that the Ukrainians are dealing with today in the current conflict. So everything's going swimmingly, and then everything just slows down. There's another encirclement that takes place. They move into Smolensk. Elements of von Bodenstern's 29th Motorized Division of Guderian 2nd Panzer Group. They move into Smolensk on the 16th of July, and along with Hoth, they conduct another major encirclement, several more Russian armies destroyed, but they hold the Germans up. They hold the Germans up for about 3 weeks or so, and they're just from I think the Russians started counterattacking significantly in early July. Then in late July, I think that was called the Timoshenko offensive, and they're trying to relieve the trapped forces, and they're just putting so much pressure on Army Group Center with their attacks that on even though the pocket is finally cleared up by the 5th of August, the Smolensk pocket, several 100,000 more prisoners are taken, thousands of tanks destroyed, but the Russian front, the Red Army front, is still intact. Much to the chagrin of the attacking Germans. So what does Hitler do on the 30th of July, 1941? He stops the attack along the 600 or 700-kilometer front of Army Group Center, puts them on the defensive. And as you know, at this point, from the middle of August through, I think, when Hitler made his final, the middle of July until Hitler made his final decision on the 21st of August, there's a big conflict between Hitler and the high command. Well, what do we do? Implicit in this argument, which ran on for 6 weeks, is that Barbarossa had failed. We never had a plan B. All our assumptions were made, whether they were operational assumptions, logistical assumptions, intelligence assumptions. They were all the rosiest assumptions we could make. We never had a plan B in case things didn't work out. So what do we do now? You had the Soviet Fifth Army nipping from the Pripyat marshes area, nipping it at Field Marshal von Bock's right flank. That needed to be taken care of. Hoth needed help. Rundstedt, who again had the smallest force, he needed additional help if he was going to continue to advance toward Leningrad. So what do we do? Do we continue on toward Moscow as the German general staff and most of the generals wanted to do, or do we shift the panzer groups to help Army Group North toward Leningrad and to help Rundstedt in the south in the Ukraine? And in this case, I actually think Hitler made the right decision in first trying to clear the situations on his flanks, because in the first of all, the Germans were not ready to move immediately on Moscow after the Smolensk Kesselschlacht commenced, the Smolensk encirclement battle. They needed a certain amount of time to replenish and at least partially re-equip their forces. And I remember Hitler came and he spoke with von Bock and the commander, other top lieutenants of Army Group Center. I think he went to where was von Bock's headquarters? Borisov, or maybe it was at Smolensk at this time. Hitler came and met with von Bock, Guderian, Hoth, and others, and asked them what their opinion was. And of course, they all wanted to move on Moscow. And Hoth said he would be, or Guderian said he would be ready to advance around the 15th of August. I don't quite know how, given the logistical problems and how run down their vehicles were, but that's what he said he could do. Hoth, I think, needed a little more time and said he'd be ready around the 20th of August. Well, in any case, Hitler made his decision on the 21st of August. And again, keep in mind, all this time, Army Group Center has not moved forward. It had been stopped on the 30th of July, and it's still facing massive attacks along its front from the Russian forces. So Hitler sends most of Hoth's armor up to help von Rundstedt in the north. And by early September, around the 3rd or 4th, German long-range artillery is already firing into Leningrad, and they push literally into the suburbs of Leningrad. But of course, that's as far as they would ever get. And then the 900-day siege started. In the south, two of Guderian's three Panzer Corps were sent south to cooperate with von Kleist's Army Group, 1st Panzer Group, in what would become maybe the largest encirclement battle that the world has ever seen. And if you can see what the front looked like at that time, if I had a map here, this in the central front, it bulged way into Russia toward Moscow, and then it curved back to the southwest, and you had a situation where it was easy for even you didn't have to be Clausewitz, even a neophyte, to see that the Soviet Southwestern Front had got itself in a very bad situation, that it was literally in a situation ripe for being encircled and destroyed. Well, Hitler saw that. He sent Guderian south. Kleist Panzer Group across the Dnieper, I think at Kremenchug and maybe another spot. And around the 16th, 17th of September, sometimes in some point in there, they met at a location. Their spearheads met at a location northeast, I believe it was northeast of Kiev, and they had encircled something like 9 Russian armies, 50 divisions, and the fighting would go on for some time. And they'd take another 600,000 prisoners. Okay, so that was a tremendous German victory, but still the Russians are in the field. The Soviet regime, despite all these hammer blows, has shown itself under Stalin and his leadership to be robust enough that it didn't collapse. By this point, after the purges, I think Stalin had pretty much terrorized the entire Russian leadership into submission, so they weren't going to try and get rid of him. And the actual attack toward Moscow, after Guderian had brought his forces back from the south, the armor from Army Group Center that had been sent up to encircle Moscow was sent back. 2 new panzer divisions that hadn't taken part in the original attack. The Germans began Barbarossa with 19 in their Barbarossa 4 structure with 19 panzer and I think 14 motorized divisions, but 2 of the tank units, the 2nd and 5th Panzer divisions, had been very badly beaten up in the Balkan campaign, not through combat, but just at the pretty rough terrain. And they needed a lot of maintenance. So they'd been held back and were only sent into Russia in September to reinforce von Bock's Army Group Center for the advance on Moscow. That attack, which Hitler had finally authorized on the 5th of September, that attack began literally preliminarily on the 30th of September, where Guderian only, his 2nd Panzer Group, which was on the right flank, attacked in order to take advantage of the good weather. He attacked 2 days early, and the main attack started in the early morning of the 2nd of October, 1941. And it just brings an image to my mind, which is in my big book, Barbarossa Unleashed. One of the photos that a German veteran sent me from the 22nd, from the 2nd of October. It's a picture that he took of a flight of 5 or 6 Stukas, which are off in the distance, but you can see them very clearly. They can't be more than 100 feet off the ground, and they're heading into combat. But it's an amazing photograph. But von Bock attacked with 78 divisions, I believe. Several of those were security units, dealing with the burgeoning behind the front with the burgeoning partisan threat. And I think so about 73 actually took part in the attack, and he had something like 1,500 tanks or so. And of course, initially, the progress is quite spectacular. The very next day, on the 3rd of October, Hitler goes, I believe it was, to the Kroll Opera House and says the Russian bear has been finally destroyed, and it will never, or defeated, it will never raise its ugly head again. Something to, I used to know the exact German, but I can't think of it right now. And so that's how sure of victory they were. And just a few days later, because you had the Germans rapidly broke through all along the front, and you have 2 massive encirclements developing at Vyazma, the town of Vyazma in the on the left wing. And by the way, when I was in Vyazma in June of 2016, literally on the day that was the 666th anniversary of the founding of the town. So that's just a little interesting aside. But you have a massive big encirclement developing there, with the 3rd and 4th Panzer groups, and then Guderian in the south cooperating with Maximilian von Weich's 2nd Army around Bryansk are initiating a smaller encirclement. And things seem to be proceeding from an operational perspective so perfectly that I think it was Jodl, the head of the Wehrmacht Führungsstab. What was that? What was that in English? The sort of the Wehrmacht, the operational staff of the German High Command. He said that this was proceeding just in such an absolutely classical fashion. It's either he or Halder who said that. So around the 5th, 6th, 7th October, it looks like this may bring the war to an end. And Stalin initially did not quite, and the Soviet High Command did not quite grasp what was happening. It was only after, I think, 4 or 5 days after the start of Operation Typhoon, the code name for the attack toward Moscow, that a Soviet reconnaissance plane had taken photographs of a massive German column heading on one of the, I think on the left flank, heading up toward Vyazma in that area. He returned, tried to tell to his superiors what he had seen. I don't know if he took photos of it or what or not, but he was almost imprisoned because they wouldn't believe him. Well, they finally realized that what he had said was true. And so Stalin finally woke up to the danger. General Sukhov, who I believe had begun the war as the Stalin in January of 1941 had appointed him chief of the general staff. And then by September, I know he was up with Leningrad organizing the defense of the city there. Around the 7th or so of October, Stalin called him back to rebuild the defenses in front of Moscow. And keep in mind, this initial German blow, at least on the western flank, tore open a 300-kilometer hole in the Red Army's front opposite Moscow. And the city was ripe for the taking. And that's the situation that Zhukov found. He was able to scramble together some 90,000 men, a few tanks and any tank weapons to put in front of Moscow. And the Germans made a really, really dumb mistake. They thought that Moscow was going to fall so easily. They sent, instead of sending on their left wing a large group of their tank and motorized forces directly toward Moscow. This may have been part of Huppner's, General Huppner at this time was commanding the either the fourth or third Panzer Group. I don't remember which one. But instead of sending them directly toward Moscow, they shifted their advance to the northeast toward the town of Kalinin. And in that sense, they very much diluted and weakened the drive on Moscow. Well, then the first snow fell on the 6th of October in the sector of Guderian's Second Panzer Corps or Second Panzer Group, and of course it quickly dissipated. But by the 9th of October, the Rasputitsa, what the Russians called the time without rain, had hit, and you had just days after day after day of massive rains. And of course, the Germans were aware of this. They had published, of course, before the campaign, topographical studies of the Soviet Union and what to expect at different times of the year. But unless you've actually been in the middle of the Rasputitsa, you have no effing idea what it's really like. Well, it's pretty much stopped their vehicles, their armored fighting vehicles, tanks, literally in their tracks. The infantry, much of the infantry was able to keep moving, but normally at a slower pace. And in doing so, they had to leave their heavier artillery behind and only bring their lighter weapons with them. But that slowed the German advance. And then, of course, just the continued attrition. The Germans began the campaign with a replacement army. In their replacement army, somewhere between 300 and 400,000 replacements that were earmarked for the Russian campaign. Well, of course, that wasn't nearly enough. And by September, as Halder pointed out in his diary, those additional reserves had all been used up. By the end of the end of October, around the 30th of October, the Germans stopped the offensive on Moscow because they'd reached the Clausewitzian culmination point, even though they didn't realize it or didn't want to realize it. And they put the attack on hold. But by that point, the German panzer divisions, by the beginning of November, had literally been worn to an absolute nub. If a panzer division had 10, 15 operational tanks, it was in good shape compared to the others. The infantry companies and the infantry divisions, which started the campaign with maybe 175 men, were down to 15 or 20 combat soldiers in many situations. So they had been terribly attrited, but provided with very few replacements. I mean, Hitler essentially gave them, okay, 22nd of June, my commanders on the Eastern Front, you have the largest invasion force in history, but this is all you got. You better get it done with what I've given you because you ain't getting much else. And that's the situation that they faced. Well, in the meantime, the Russians are continuing to launch various offensives which aren't very effective. They haven't learned yet how to conduct large operations with armored forces and combined arms attacks. The attacks that they do launch are poorly coordinated for the most part, with inexperienced commanders and inexperienced troops, but they're effective in that they continue to attrit the German army and to slow it down. So the whole offensive comes to a halt on the 30th of October, and then it begins again after the ground had become hardened, after the Arctic weather had finally set in. And by the way, according to the late was it RSF? I get the initials wrong. Stolfi, but Dr. Stolfi, he did some meteorological study and determined that from the meteorological records he looked at, going back a couple hundred years, as long as they were pretty much had been taken, that the winter of 41-42 was the coldest winter in Russia in 200 years. Now, I don't know whether that's still considered conventional wisdom, but it was certainly one of the coldest. Let's put it that way. And but the Germans renewed their offensive on the 15th of November, essentially just on the flanks of Moscow, and their armored forces initially managed to make appreciable advances, but of course then they're stopped. One of the interesting things here is Field Marshal von Kluge and his Fourth Army. They were directly opposite Moscow, and he wouldn't attack. He just wouldn't do it. They were his army was ensconced in very good defensive positions. They were trying to get ready, to withstand what was going to come during the winter, and he didn't want to give up those positions. Well, finally, in the final days of the German attack, he half-heartedly, I think on the 1st and 2nd of December, launched a little attack toward Moscow. It of course fell apart immediately, and by the 5th of December, Field Marshal von Bock, who by the way is sick, he's having horrific stomach issues again, for which he'd already been hospitalized once. In fact, at that point, I think it's sometime in 1940 when he was hospitalized, Hitler had actually come. He was one of Hitler's favorite generals, and Hitler had come to talk to him, and he actually talked to him at that point about what he was planning to do in Russia for that he wanted to attack the Soviet Union. So von Bock is sick. It's 35, 40 degrees below zero. By the 4th or 5th of December, the temperatures just plummeted, and he sent a Fernschreiben, basically a telegram to a teletype message to Hitler and the high command, saying essentially, dudes, we are totally out of gas. We cannot go forward another step. And right at that time, on the 5th of December, the Soviets began their counteroffensive on the Central Front, which they had been building up for weeks, and which caught the Germans entirely by surprise. Their Fremde Heere Ost, their Foreign Armies East intelligence agency, who was run by some nitwit who really didn't even know anything about intelligence. And that's part of the fault of the German general staff. Everything for the general staff had to do with operations. If you had the proper operational scheme, you were going to win. They completely undersold. No, I shouldn't say completely, but of course, but they completely shortchanged the field of logistics and intelligence, and their best officers were not. Uh, uh, you did not find their best officers working in the field of logistics or intelligence. So, anyways, Foreign Armies East, just a day or two before that, had come to the conclusion that the Soviets were in as bad a shape as the Germans were, and in no there was not going to be any attack because they would be incapable of doing so. So here you have a situation where the Germans on the Central Front in particular, and also in the North, I'll say with Army Group North around Tikhvin and so forth, are in these entirely exposed positions, totally exhausted. They're well beyond their Clausewitzian culmination point, and they're not ready. They're not in positions where they're ready to defend. And then the Russian counterattack begins. And by the 15th, within 10 days, on both flanks around Moscow, they had pushed back both Guderian spearheads in the south, and then the armored spearheads in the north, pushed them back from Moscow, and then eventually they after that they attacked in the center against Fourth Army, and this is a whole other topic to get into the campaign in the winter. But let me stop at that point, because clearly Barbarossa had failed. That was clear to everyone certainly by the 8th of December, when the Germans issued a major directive that they were going over to the defensive. And to recap, why did they fail? First of all, as a terrific historian, and why can't I think of his first name? His last name is Johnson, and he wrote a great. He was an English historian. He passed away not too long ago, and he wrote a great history of the 20th century. And he pointed out, first of all, he pointed out that 1941 was the most important year of the 20th century, and it was not really because of Pearl Harbor, but it was because of Operation Barbarossa, and how that literally changed the arc of history for decades to come, which of course is a story for another day. But he pointed out, which is a very basic but very true observation, Barbarossa was simply underpowered. Despite the fact that it was the largest fighting force, invasion force that had ever been put in the field, it simply was not large enough to deal with all the issues, the unprecedented issues, the depth of and width of the battlefield, the size of the opposing forces, the terrible conditions of the roads, and the lack of major highways and railroads. One point here, the German Oster that attacked Russia was really not that much larger than the forces that they had used to invade France. Now, they had 250 assault guns instead of just 10, which they had tried out during the French campaign. They had not particularly any more tanks, maybe a few hundred more, but they had better ones. They had, as I pointed out earlier, they had more Panzer IIIs and IVs, less of the Panzer Is and IIs. But their Luftwaffe, they actually attacked the Soviet Union with, in the Luftwaffe force structure, had 200 fewer bombers than in the campaign against France, which is kind of hard to believe, but is true. So that's the first thing, is that it was simply underpowered. The second thing I would say is the Germans, they simply they were prepared to fight a campaign that would maybe advance as far as the western Dvina and Dnieper rivers, about 500 kilometers, logistically prepared to do that, and to do that without the railroads, essentially. I mean, they had outfitted their tanks with extra containers of fuel and so forth, and they had the truck space attached to the organic truck space attached to the different to the three army groups that was going to carry them logistically as far as that 500-kilometer limit. After that, they really needed to depend on the railroads, which, again, typical of their assumptions, they figured they were going to capture these railroads and a lot of the rolling stock and the Soviet locomotives intact. Well, that didn't happen, as we know. And so literally as early as August, you see Army Group Center suffering from not yet catastrophic, but some somewhat serious supply problems, which by the fall of 1941 had become literally catastrophic. Almost nothing was getting through. And I remember, for example, in a history of the 6th Infantry Division, which Dr. Hoppe had fought in this book, he describes, and I think in their war diary, they lived off of potatoes and honey for like weeks, because no hot food, nothing. They'd used up their iron rations. Nothing was getting through to them. So they weren't prepared logistically. Their intelligence was bad. Those are perhaps secondary factors to just the fact that they didn't have enough men and equipment. And then, of course, yes, the weather played a role. What Clausewitz called friction played a huge role. When you look at the lack of a Western European infrastructure, from the German border to Paris was, I think, 300 kilometers. From where the 4th Panzer Division was situated south of Brest-Litovsk, I think, along the German-Russian demarcation line to Moscow, was exactly 1,000 kilometers. So it was an infinitely larger task that they were undertaking in the Russian campaign, and they kind of understood that, and yet they didn't. As I said, they did not have a plan B for almost anything. And then we have to look at, obviously, at the Red Army itself, and how tenaciously it fought, and the ability of the Red Army to mobilize the regeneration process, to mobilize, as I said, 50 new armies to keep their Air Force pretty much in the field. In fact, in some areas, by as early as September 1941, the Russians had reestablished air superiority, because the Luftwaffe the attrition of the Luftwaffe was even greater than the attrition of the army. Just simply on the 22nd of June, that great day for the German Luftwaffe, they lost 78 planes. 78 planes out of 2,250 that were operational. That's like 3%. 3% of its force in one day. Do the math. And so by with the front being funnel-like, by late summer, they were only over the Luftwaffe was largely just fighting over the spearheads of the attacking German forces, and infantry units like 4th Army, 9th Army, what have you. They just the Luftwaffe didn't have enough coverage, didn't have enough planes to provide air superiority for those units. So it was the ability of the Red Army to regenerate its forces, here and its strategy as well. Here you have to go to Zhukov, who literally after the first few days of the campaign, about around the 26th of June, he and I think Vasilevsky or some of the other top Russian commanders, but it was largely Zhukov, came up with a defensive plan which called for just a defense in depth, just layered defensive lines leading on the central front all the way back to Moscow, which the Germans would have to just bite their way through and suffer serious attrition in the process. So they started implementing that strategy under Zhukov's, which Zhukov had devised very early on. And of course, it was what you would call an active defense. It was, as I've described, and I don't think I need to go into any more detail, it was hardly a passive defense. So the ability of the Russians to fight, to continually put new forces in the field, implement a reasonably effective active defensive strategy, and that played a huge part in their success. And then, of course, the weather as well. Again, that's the whole issue of Clausewitzian friction, where things happen and occur that just undermine the best plans, that are going to slow you down. And the way Clausewitz describes friction in his book on war, it's very interesting. And this is my last point, and I'll shut up. He describes a man, I don't know if it was an aristocrat or what he was, but he had to travel between point A and B in his wagon. And the wagon's hitched to the horses and so forth, and he expects to get there in like 3 hours or whatever. Well, they start moving along, and one of the horses turns out to be sick, and so they have to find another horse. I don't remember if these are the exact details, but then one of the wooden wheels breaks, and the road's a little bumpier than you see what I'm getting at. That's the whole issue of friction that affected the German army literally from the moment it crossed the frontier, and meant that oil, the consumption of petrol and oil, filters that they used for their tanks and stuff was infinitely greater than they thought it was going to be. And you add all this up, and it resulted in Hitler experiencing the same fate as Napoleon, or Charles Charles the 12th or Charles II, I don't remember, or any of the others who had the audacity to try and invade Russia. So in any case, I think I've gone on long enough and given you the benefit of what I can still remember about Operation Barbarossa.